I get to use my one phrase of Cantonese. Gong hei fat choi, xin nian kuai le. I love gong hei fat choi because I mean even gong chi fat cai. Those of you that don't speak Chinese, I mean it's like congratulations, get rich, right? Right? I mean I just loved. I mean I lived in China and Taiwan for 6.5 years, and there are phrases like that just make it. You just want to keep studying the language and speaking it. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I know I have a few new people, and I fancy other folks will be coming in as the weather's delayed a few, but I appreciate it that all of you did make it here in a timely fashion. My name is Jennifer Turner. I know that there are some folks that came in from ECSP and Asia program who may not know me or my program. I direct the China Environment Forum, which since 1997 has been bringing government, NGO, business, and researchers in U.S. and Asia together to focus on sustainable development issues in China. We've done actually an awful lot on water, which is why I was really excited when I heard that Evelyn was going to come to the States, because in all honesty, in my 8 years here, I've never done a meeting on the Mekong. Very embarrassed. But so you're correcting that shortcoming of my program. And today our meeting is titled Environmental Security and Regional Politics in the Mekong Basin. And as you see, we have two speakers here today. First will be Dr. Evelyn Goh. She's a university lecturer in international relations and a fellow of St. Anne's College, University of Oxford. Her research interests, I guess, for the past 10 years, I fancy it was also your dissertation? No, not even that. Oh, wow. So, well, she's focused a lot on the Mekong, on security issues in Southeast Asia. She has an upcoming book that's listed on the back of the participant sheet, Developing the Mekong, Regionalism and Regional Security in China, Southeast Asian Relations. When that book comes out, you have to let us know. We'll put a link to it on our website. Promotion. Hopefully, it's not going to be too expensive, is it? Okay, good. Sometimes. Just joke. That's cruel and unusual of me to say. And so she's going to be talking about her research just in China not too long ago, after doing many trips on the Mekong, and so going to give a talk about some of the security issues surrounding the Mekong, and I think the Q&A will be particularly fun. And then we also have Mr. Carl Brook. Did I say your name right? Is that close enough? Is it right? So embarrassing. It's like I speak Chinese and can't even say American names. He's a senior attorney and co-director of international programs at the Environmental Law Institute. A few months ago, I was honored to be a commentator at a small workshop at Environmental Law Institute where Carl and a number of his colleagues, he had folks from Japan and Africa, who had been doing an amazing study looking at transboundary impact assessments around the world, mainly Africa and Asia, and could do it in the U.S. eventually, too. U.S.-Mexico would be fascinating. But they were looking at some of the process. How have they been done? What are some of the shortcomings? And I was really intrigued by this because I've been looking a lot at domestically in China environmental impact assessments, which if you grab the publication on the table, the China Environment Series Issue 8, there are a number of articles looking at how the environmental impact assessment process has been given a lot of more political support, both from the grassroots and the top down in China. So I was very intrigued about then taking this idea a step further in terms of transboundary. And so he's going to talk a little bit about the study more generally that they've been doing, because I think to compare is very important. I mean, there have been some relatively successful cases in Africa, and then he'll focus in on the Mekong study. I also want to note, before I let them start talking, is that the China Environment Forum for the last couple of years has been supported by grants from USAID, Rockefeller Brother Fund, Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the Japan Foundation's Center for Global Partnership. I'm like NPR, the little advertisement at the end there. And so and before they start, I'd like to just go around the room quick so you know who's here. Okay, just real quickly, can you say your name and affiliation?
I'm Leo Foxrue from WWF.
Hannah Hosatani from US Asia Institute.
Wang Leong, George Washington University.
I'm Zach Miller, I'm also from George Washington University. And EPA. Sorry.
I'm going to do this. Jennifer Lee from George Mason University and the Foundation for Environmental Security and Sustainability.
Claudia Ringler from the International Food Policy Research Institute.
Steve Randolph, National Defense University.
Yeah. Shane Guam at Wilson Center.
Lancang, American University.
Nick Hemisevich, the Heritage Foundation.
Good morning. I'm Kevin Quigley with the National Peace Corps Association.
Davis Cherry, Strategic Forecasting. Morning. My name is Jacob Green. I'm independent historical researcher in Washington, and I'm very interested in China issues. So very happy to be here. Thank you.
Mark Moore, Asia Program Wilson Center.
Akiko Shirai of Mitsubishi International Corporation.
Welcome.
Greg Christensen, the State Department Fellow in the Office of Senator Snow.
Sean Martin from World Wildlife Fund.
Michael Martin from Congressional Research Service.
Lyndon Ellis for Woodrow Wilson Center China Environment Fund.
And in the back rows?
Shiga, Rule of Law Initiative, American Bar Association.
Nice to meet you. Oh, welcome.
Bo Xu, Chinese branch at Voice of America.
Rick Finney with Radio Free Asia.
Risek Poach, Voice of America, Cambodia Service.
Ellen Rebel, Resources for the Future, and former Peace Corps China.
Yes. I was actually going to say that because I was very excited the two of you were here. Okay, well let's Evelyn.
Thank you.
You may take the stage.
Thank you for inviting me. This is a great pleasure to be able to talk about the Mekong in DC. I have to admit that one of the subversive agenda of doing this book was to try to have a bit of policy impact, policy awareness impact outside of Southeast Asia and China on this issue. It's a bit of a mixed audience, and I would say at the outset that the presentation is based on the small book that's coming out in June. It's being published by the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London. So it's one of the Adelphi paper monographs. And the work here is targeted much more at making a case for why China-Southeast Asian dynamics in the Mekong Basin have security implications, regional security implications. And within the monograph, I also make the case that security, obviously in this context, has to be addressed broadly, not just in terms of interstate security, but also in terms of intranational issues, transnational issues of security at human and societal levels. I am going to use an old-fashioned overhead projector. Again, just a basic map of the region for those who may not be awfully familiar with the Mekong. The Mekong, for those interested in China-Southeast Asia relations, of course, quite a unique and convenient unit of analysis. This is the longest river in Southeast Asia, originates in Tibet, flows through Yunnan province in southwestern China, comes through 5 countries in Southeast Asia, covering a great deal of the Southeast Asian mainland. It's geographically a uniting factor, but also increasingly economically a uniting factor on mainland Southeast Asia. Since the Paris Peace Accords, which brought the Indo-Chinese conflicts to an end in the early 1990s, there's been a huge drive for development in the region, very much concentrated in the Mekong Basin. I tried to do 3 things in this study. The key aim is to draw together that link between regionalism in this part of the world and security. Much of the development drive, as I indicated before, is happening on a sort of regional basis, with the aim of drawing together mainland Southeast Asia and the growing Chinese market as a sort of, an integrated economic region, if you like. And this is being done in a variety of ways, which I'll go into a little bit later in the presentation. In so doing, of course, there are other unplanned effects of drawing together riparian states in this river basin, many of which have, I think, negative effects on security issues, which is what I go on to talk about at the end of the presentation. I was particularly interested in doing this. I have a long-standing interest in analyzing the impacts of the rise of China on the region. Southeast Asia is very often written about these days as, the part of China's periphery that has the best sort of, report card, as it were, of China behaving nicely to its neighbors, mutually beneficial development, nice engagement in regional institutions, overall good side of the story. And given that, it's a nice sort of case study to use to test that presentation of the way things are. The other reason why this is good, I think, is when we think about Southeast Asia, much of the work is usually written about maritime Southeast Asia, right? The far more vocal, strategically prominent countries of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia to some extent. And much less attention is paid to continental Southeast Asia. In fact, much of the sort of presentation of this is that continental Southeast Asia in the Chinese states pretty much ceded to Chinese influence by this point. Again, useful to test these ideas rather than simply taking them for granted. So if you would allow me to sort of skip over the regionalism and security type connections, which I'd be happy to go into in the discussion, and sort of jump quickly into the regionalism aspect of this, developmental regionalism in the Mekong Basin. Maybe a bit blurry, I hope you can see this. This part of the world is currently being sold as something called the Greater Mekong Subregion. This is a term that's been made up by the Asian Development Bank, which has been the driver of development in this part of the world since the early 1990s, has managed to raise a significant amount of money for development plans, and has also helped to attract significant foreign investment for these plans. It's not a very clear map, but to give you an idea of sort of the main idea of sort of regionalism in the Mekong currently. Three things are happening here. Lots of this is about infrastructure development, right? It's all about how do we make this a region physically? How do we connect it, and how do we make it sort of viable as an economic unit? So three kinds of connections in the infrastructural sense happening. Road links, very importantly, east to west, north to south. And the key idea here, of course, is to link the ports on the South China Sea to the ports on the Andaman Indian Ocean side of the Southeast Asian mainland, and to connect the South China market to the Southeast Asian markets as well. Related to this are the attempts to open up the river itself for navigation for big ships, so that goods can be brought up and down the river. This, of course, is a dangerous and tricky, expensive enterprise that's been sort of dreamt about since the days of the French in Indochina. It's never really been done properly because it's just too expensive. It's currently being funded to some extent by the Chinese, whom obviously have the greatest interest in opening up the river for navigation of ships up to 500 tons, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. The third way in which the region has been connected, and this has particular relevance for the rest of the discussion, is the building of a power grid, which will integrate Southeast Asia and Southern China as an energy market. Now, this power grid is being funded largely by individual countries going through the Asian Development Bank to seek funding from donors and other kinds of foreign investors to build individual sections of this grid. The idea, of course, is that you can then connect hydropower, particularly producers on various parts of the mainstream and on tributaries of the river, to markets, which are obviously by geographical quirk not where the hydropower stations are. So these are the sort of three ways in which the region's being sort of connected. Now, if you look carefully at this connection and sort of take a cost-benefit, for each country, what becomes very, very clear is that the country that stands to gain most from this is China. In two ways. Strategically very important is the idea of diversifying potential routes for trade, but also for energy transport. The road links that are being built will connect southern China or southwestern China overland to important ports in Burma on the coast, that would be a nice alternative to using the Malacca Straits, which is what is currently being used. That's one alternative. The other alternative is the river. The amount of blasting and channel clearing, which Carl will talk about, that's gone on up to this point has been complemented by agreements with the various other Mekong River riparian states for the transport of oil upriver into China. A lot of this is now happening from Thai refineries up the river into Yunnan. And at the moment we're looking at quantities only in the last year, which potentially could bring about 10% of China's annual needs up the river that way. A bit more expensive than doing by sea, but an alternative route. Now, because Jennifer is harsh about time, she'll move on. The third part of the paper, which is I think the part that this audience would be most interested in, is the part that sort of draws the connection between these developments and security, ideas of security in this region. And here I argue that development regionalism has brought with it security implications in two ways. One, it exacerbates some of the existent problems caused by power asymmetry in the region. Look at this. What you basically have is a very clear correlation between political economic power and geographical advantage on this river. What you have is the weakest countries downstream, ecologically weakest positions, but also politically and economically weakest positions. So that power asymmetry is very much exacerbated by these new developments in the river basin. That's one way. Secondly, the development regionalism in the river basin has led to new kinds of insecurities, which were not there before. Many of these transboundary issues. And in this regard, there's sort of three issues that I pick out. Of course, there are many, but three issues that I pick out that I think are of particular importance for us to pay attention to. First is that very traditional national resource security issue, obviously. Interstate water allocation conflicts, the fact that upstream states are in a position to control the amount and the quality of water that's available to downstream states is one of these excellent, geographical problems one has in a shared river basin. Now, this is, of course, being badly exacerbated by development plans upstream. This is a map of again, I'm sorry it's not very clear, but this is just a rough map of the hydropower projects planned for the three main rivers in Yunnan province. The one we're interested in is the Lancang, which is the one in the middle, where you have the sort of three on the left. You have the Nujiang, Lancang, and the Jinshajiang. And Lancang, of course, is the upstream of the Mekong in this part of China. And as you can see, that just gives you a very quick idea of the numbers of sort of hydropower projects being planned in that province, which is one of the sort of highest hydropower potential provinces in the country. China currently is the only country in the Mekong which has mainstream hydropower projects. Other countries downstream obviously have running hydropower projects, and ones being built, but all these are in tributaries, not on the mainstream. This has already had some impact on countries downstream in terms of unusually fluctuating water levels, declining fish stocks, floods which have washed away other people's lands and crops, animals, and so on and so forth. A lot of this is being done, documented at a local level, particularly in the Thai section of the basin, by sort of local communities trained by NGOs to collect this material. And the Chinese dams are not very old. The sort of oldest one on the mainstream was sort of completed 1993. So we obviously have a bit of a data problem, but I think with a 15-year record, there is sort of fairly enough to go on to be concerned about this. Here, though, I think it's important to make the point that it's not simply China that's perpetuating this upstream-downstream conflict problem. The issue of upstream hydropower and other kinds of water abstraction and diversion projects having impacts on downstream countries is replicated consistently throughout the Mekong Basin as you go downstream. Carl's going to talk about the Yalie Falls Dam project, which is on the Laos-Cambodia border. And again, that's another case study of what's happening here. So slightly problematic. There are many people who would, be very, very sort of quick and tempted to say, well, yes, and this is another example of the way China is bullying its neighbors, and it's not joined any of the regional institutions that govern sustainable development and environmental security. It's been slow to provide information, and this is a really sort of negative example of China's approach to its neighbors. Well, yes, all that is true. On the other hand, we have a situation where downstream states in the Mekong have exactly the same kinds of ambitions as the Chinese do in terms of exploiting the river. And as a result, find themselves in a highly weakened situation when it comes to protesting, campaigning against, or asking for reconsiderations of large hydropower plants. It's a bit of a, moral problem here, as well as a collective action problem. The second way to look at sort of that regionalism security connection is obviously the issue of human and societal security. And here we can talk a bit more about this in the question and answer section. But again, well documented examples from other parts of the world where large dams have been built in transboundary river basins, and we know, of some of the greatest ecological impacts downstream of these things, including sort of, changing sedimentation patterns, water levels, water temperatures, all of which have grave implications for communities that depend on the river. And in the Mekong, this is a basin which has in its lower reaches 80 to 90% of populations dependent upon the river directly for agriculture, transport. These are largely, rural communities. So particularly in Cambodia, we're talking about quite serious human security impacts. Third way to look at that connection between regionalism and security is the issue of economic security. And here I've chosen to take a much more sort of national approach to this and look at the case study of Laos. Laos is a midstream state on the Mekong, geographically quite terribly disadvantaged, landlocked, mountainous, small population, really quite limited prospects for the kind of industrial economic development path that is often promoted for underdeveloping countries. And as a result, hydropower development is sort of right at the top of the Lao government's agenda for how to develop the country. Unfortunately, all sorts of problems with this. The dangers, of course, of economic dependency arising from this, particularly because the main energy market in this part of the world is Thailand. And the Laotians have been selling energy to Thailand for a long time. And have had in this period very sort of negative experiences, as you would expect, given a monopolistic situation of price bargaining. When the Chinese cascade comes on board in the upstream, that will also pose some degree of economic competition. The Chinese dams, because they're funded by state subsidies, produce electricity at a cheaper rate than the Lao ones, which are funded largely by foreign financiers. So as a result, this kind of issue of increased dependency due to regional development is, I think, quite an understudied aspect of the problem. I'm going to sort of draw this to a close so that we can have a chance for more time for discussion, and I'd invite you to ask me more specific questions according to your interests in the question and answer section. Thank you.
I'm going to do a little musical chairs here. And I'll ask the AV folks to turn on the opposite screen. Right now his PowerPoint will be here. In a moment it will be on the other screen. Just go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. It's wonderful to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. This is a wonderful forum that you put on.
Thank you.
Today I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of a project that we are concluding in partnership with the University of Tokyo and the United Nations Environment Program. And the basic premise behind the project is that transboundary impact assessment, or TIA, is an important planning tool. It shapes decisions, sets out options, analyzes the social, economic, and environmental implications of those decisions. The problem is, nobody has really gone back and said, is this an accurate planning tool? Are we actually predicting the effects that we think we're predicting? Are we consistently under-predicting or over-predicting certain effects? And what are the factors that influence the accuracy of a transboundary impact assessment? So, in partnership, ELI, University of Tokyo, and UNEP developed a template to compare predicted with actual impacts. And as proof of concept, we developed 5 case studies, 2 of them in Southeast Asia and 3 in Africa. So one is the navigation channel improvement project of the Lancang Mekong River, which Evelyn had alluded to earlier. The Yalie Falls Dam in the broader context of hydropower development in the Basin Basin. And these are the 2 that I'll focus on today. The other 3, though, will factor in when I talk about the broad lessons learned. One is control of water hyacinth in Lake Victoria, the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, and Apupa Dam, which is a proposed dam between Angola and Namibia. And you'll see that within these projects there is some geographic diversity of types of projects, dams, channelization, water hyacinth control, and a range of results, success, controversy, and somewhere in between. So starting with the Lancang Mekong River, and this I should note is by Nahu Mirumachi, Mikiyasu Nakayama, and colleagues at the University of Tokyo. The goal was to improve navigation along the stretch of river, and you'll see right here, starting in Laos, extending along the Thai border, Myanmar, and into China. And the first phase was completed, the first of 3. And this includes, among others, removal of 51 rapids and shoals. There was an initial report of environmental impact assessment conducted in 2001. The team comprised 6 representatives from China, 3 from Laos, 1 from Myanmar, and 4 from Thailand. And it was predicted that Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand would be affected. And I'm going to walk through a few of the different types of effects here: water quantity, water velocity, environmental impacts, socioeconomic impacts. On water quantity, it was predicted that the water level would fluctuate some, but it'd be minor, and generally not varying more than 30 centimeters, and generally not more than 2.5 kilometers downstream. And it was asserted that each of the individual shoals and rapids did not interact with one another. So there is no cumulative impact of removing multiple shoals. It was observed, however, that water fluctuation was more significant than predicted. Saw fluctuation in some of the tributaries. One of the interesting things is that where there had been seasonal fluctuation, now there were fluctuations on almost a daily basis without any sort of notice. And this, for those who have a background in physics, this is like, think of these dams as capacitors. You know, they catch the water and then slowly discharge them. You take away all those capacitors and you just have a straight shot right down the river. Water velocity. They looked at 3 specific rapids and said it's very clear that waterway improvement produces very small impact on water velocity. And when they were actually blasting the reefs in some of the shoals, they saw that it was moving faster than they expected. And in fact, some of the Chinese engineers in one instance did not clear an entire reef because of the fear of increased velocity. Now, if you have water velocity increasing and greater fluctuations, what happens to soil loss and erosion? The predicted was that no change in velocity, no real change in fluctuation, so no soil erosion. Observed quite a bit of erosion. Riverbanks, sandbars, and islets that have been there in the dry season are now non-existent. They've been washed away. This has economic impacts, as we will see soon, because the local people use them for riverbank gardens. Several villages in Laos and Thailand experienced loss of housing from erosion during the flood season. The broad predictions of socioeconomic impacts are that there will be no social impacts, and that the economic impacts are generally going to be better because we're improving the quality of life, and there may be some diseases that are introduced or facilitated through the increased transportation. They have seen a number of impacts on fishing, which has then led to a decrease in the number of fishermen. In Thailand, there's a loss of arable riverbeds. There have been numerous reports of increased illegal trade of wildlife, timber, and drugs, facilitated by the improved navigation. Second case study is hydropower development in the Basin River Basin, including Yalie Falls Dam. This is by Andrew Wyatt at the University of Sydney. And you'll see there in red the Basin River. And one of the interesting points that Evelyn raised is that there is this dynamic that when a lot of countries are wanting to develop their hydropower capacity. And the Yalie Falls Dam is on the Vietnamese side of the border. And one of the challenges is that while there have been great effects downstream in Cambodia, Cambodia wants to develop their own hydropower. And so it is difficult for them to protest too loudly about the merits of large dams. It is also of note that the people who are most affected in that part of Cambodia are minorities that are not particularly friendly to the government in power. Moreover, the government in power is indebted to the Vietnamese for kicking out the Khmer Rouge. So there are a lot of political dynamics that influence how you respond to inadequate transboundary impact assessments. In short, the assessment that was done focused on a stretch of the Basin River 8 kilometers downstream and 1 kilometer wide. It did not consider any impacts in Cambodia. And they've seen impacts in 2 provinces in Cambodia, 70 kilometers and more than 200 kilometers downstream. They've seen erosion, and I should note that Yalie Falls is what's called a peaking power dam. So it is, they release water when they need the power, which is usually during the day, and during the evening don't need it, so they slow the flow down, which leads to great fluctuations in flow through the river. And you can see here, the red is 2001, where it's starting to come online, and there's not much fluctuation that is discernible. There's fluctuation, but it's not consistent. Then you see it in 2002, very even daily fluctuations associated with the peaking. Then in 2003, those peaks get even greater as they ramp it up. So you're getting very strong fluctuations that leads to erosion, riverbank loss. A lot of the villagers have lost, it was estimated, more than 40,000 chickens, thousands of pigs and ducks, hundreds of buffaloes and cows, approximately $800,000 worth of damage. just in material losses. Number of riverine plants have diminished in numbers due to the flooding. Habitat for birds and turtles and others have been affected. And one of the interesting things is that they're starting to see toxic blue-green algae that may, it's unclear, but that may be associated with the Yalie Reservoir. And there have been health impacts. Respiratory problems, stomach problems, irritation, dizziness, and vomiting. The lessons learned here apply broadly across the 5 case studies. And we should note that this is a fairly small sample size. This is more based on what we have seen. What have we noticed? And one of the things that consistently among the 5 case studies, lack of data is a significant challenge. You don't have the baseline data. You don't have the data on current status in many cases. So often you are relying both in the impact assessment in the first place and then in the comparison on limited data and on interviews with people living in the area and then professional judgments. Now, in the impact assessment, this is considered best available data. But when it comes time to challenge the impacts and say, wait a minute, this is having an impact on these communities, that data is dismissed as anecdotal. So there is a disconnect in how the same sort of data is viewed at time of impact assessment and subsequent to the construction. This also highlights the need for long-term monitoring so that the data of monitoring from one dam can provide baseline data for subsequent dams so that you at least have the ability to look forward. One of the difficulties also is that there is generally not a clear set of requirements, that many of the impact assessments were done on an ad hoc basis. They were done sometimes pursuant to national law, but often some sort of combination of laws between the countries, or in the case of Lake Victoria, it was done pursuant to a national law, but then they said, when they did the public consultation, you need to consult the countries and the publics in the other countries of Uganda. Uganda has to consult with Tanzania and Kenya. And the Uganda government said, okay, we'll do that. And they did something that had not been done before, and that is a transboundary assessment. This was supposed to be a domestic assessment, but it wound up being a transboundary assessment. It was all done ad hoc. The composition of the TIA team can affect the objectivity, both in terms of actual objectivity and also in terms of perceived objectivity, that some people have called into question the impact assessment for the channelization of the Mekong River because it was dominated both in terms of the number of staff and the process by the Chinese counterparts. The process of conducting a TIA can improve institutional, and I should also note that this is not necessarily saying that there was bias, but that there were perceptions of bias based on how it was done. The process of conducting a TIA can improve institutional coordination and collaboration. We saw this especially in the African case studies. Lake Victoria, to a certain extent in Upupa Dam, where there was better coordination among the governmental institutions participating, and also between the governmental actors and the non-governmental actors. It's very important to note the role of political support. Political support, if it is by way of a mandate, can be very important, as in Lake Victoria, but political pronouncements about what the outcome is going to be can be polarizing and counterproductive. This happened in Upupa Dam, where the government basically branded anyone who opposed the dam as traitors. So it did not create an opportunity for any sort of dialogue. One of the most interesting aspects is the range of public involvement. Where there is active involvement by the public and the governments are willing to listen, the TIA has been much more accurate. The Lake Victoria TIA, and I'll talk about that in a moment, was pretty much, it predicted what would happen. But that was because there was broad public participation in the process. Where the public is not involved, the TIA is much more problematic. The navigation channel, there was very little time for public participation. Only a small portion of the public actually involved. Environmental impacts underpredicted, and the social impacts were not considered seriously in the analysis. Where the public is involved, but the outcome appears to be prejudged, the TIA process can be stalled by controversy, as in the Apupa Dam. Apupa Dam is also notable for the experience in having an independent third-party observer that can help to provide a measure of objectivity and rigor, and also comfort many of the stakeholders who then feel that trust that the process is not going to be hijacked by one interest or another. I want to talk just very, very briefly about Lake Victoria because I keep referencing it here. The project was to remove water hyacinth, which was clogging many of the places along the northern side of Lake Victoria near the outflow into the Nile. It was affecting the operation of the dam. It was also affecting the ability of communities to catch fish. And so they wanted to treat it with mechanical collection so that you would have rakes, biological treatment, that weevils that would eat the water hyacinth, and chemicals, herbicides. And the TIA, or what was then the EIA, said there'd be no impacts from any of these. And the local NGOs, the government did consultation pursuant to their EIA regulations within the country, and the local communities and NGOs said, we really don't like the herbicides. We're not certain about the bugs. The rakes are okay. But you should, since this is a shared lake, you really need to be talking to Kenya and Tanzania. The government, to their credit, said, that's a good idea. And they did talk to them. And Kenya and Tanzania said, yeah, we're not crazy about the herbicides either, but if you could do some tests on the weevils to make sure that they are specific, that is to say, if you release them, are they only going to eat the water hyacinth, or are they then going to go after other things? And after some tests, they found that yes, they are specific to the water hyacinth, and they did the project using mechanical and biological means. This turned out to be very effective. Part of it was that through the process, they relied on the communities to do much of the mechanical process, contributing their labor for free. And because they had been involved in the consultation and discussion, they did it. And the dam, the Hydropower Authority, contributed gloves and rakes and other things. There were some mechanical harvesters that were essentially on barges that would collect the things, but those did not work as well. A lot of the rakes worked quite well. But the point here is that how you develop and design your project can affect the accuracy of TIA. One of the interesting observations just broadly is that rarely, if ever, do the TIAs overpredict the impacts. They almost always underpredict the impacts. They're almost always more severe. The other thing that is interesting is that the environmental impacts tend to be a little bit more accurately predicted than the social impacts. Social impacts often are much worse than predicted. One of the other interesting observations is that a single mistake early in the process of the analysis can lead to many mistakes downstream. And we saw this with the navigation channel improvement case study, where it was assumed that there'd be no change in velocity. Therefore, no change in water fluctuation, therefore no change in erosion, boom, boom, boom. And this is essentially a domino effect. TIA problems are often associated with insufficient time to collect the data, do the analysis, and consult the public. And we saw this especially in the navigation channel improvement and in the Yalie Falls. One of the things that we were surprised by was that there were silver linings. Even where there is a problematic experience, you wind up having some changes. So we saw Lake Victoria. I don't know if you'd say that's problematic, but it started out very narrowly. But with the process, they wound up consulting with the governments, set in motion a process for governing environment around Lake Victoria among the three countries. Also started East African Community Guidelines on Transboundary Impact Assessment. This also helped to inform the development of EIA regulations in Kenya and Tanzania. So that where they saw, wait a minute, there's a problem here, we're not considering the transboundary impacts, and there isn't much of a framework, that then led to the development of such frameworks. Secondly, with the Pupa Dam, where there was a very polarized dialogue, we saw that this process led to a new way of relating to the public, of engaging the public in the process, even if it was polarized. As with the assessments, we see that the mitigation measures often are more accurate on environmental issues than on social issues. There is an over-reliance in a number of these projects, though, on mitigation, because the assumption is the project's going to go forward. We just need to figure out how to control the damages. It's not a question of, should we be building it? Should we be building it here? So that is one of the things that is worth noting. And finally, I want to close with just a few comments. Since this was a proof of concept, we're looking at other experiences to analyze, experiences in developed countries, capacity building, technical assistance. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Good. I'd like to open up the floor for some questions. I like the macro and micro kind of angles we had here. And please say your name and affiliation to remind them who you are. Oh, and we do, since we're webcasting, I must ask you to speak into the microphone, which is officially being handed to you. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. These are terrific presentations, both of them. And I'm really personally very interested in this because I've got a project I'm Richard Cronin at the Henry L. Stifton Center. Sorry about that. And I've got a project that I'm pursuing on this issue. Just several questions to throw out to both of you, if I could. First of all, just a comment on the China versus downstream countries' dams. I mean, there's a huge scale difference here. So, the Xiwan Dam is, 15 billion cubic meters of water behind it. And there's more, already China has more installed hydropower than all of the lower Mekong countries together. So that's an issue. Where should this issue be addressed? In other words, we've got the MRC, Mekong River Commission, with only 4 downstream members. China and Burma are, observers. So, is there any prospect of getting anything going there, or should it be in the ADB, Asian Development Bank, because they've got the Greater Mekong Subregion Project, and China is a member of that via Yunnan Province? Is there any indication that China has any intention of cooperating in the future to address these issues? And finally, on the issue of data, what is the feasibility of first of all, there's been lots of hydrological studies on tributaries. What is the feasibility of a hydrological model based on satellite imagery data that would model the entire basin in terms of the basic plumbing of the mainstream and the main tributaries? Can that be done? And if so, who should do it and who might do it?
I think you may have stolen some people's questions there, but those are excellent questions, correct? So, flip a coin. Would you like to start off trying to go after some of those, Evelyn?
If we work backwards, on the issue of hydrological modeling and forecasting, partly based on satellite imagery, this very much is being conducted by the Mekong River Commission, which is the coordinating body for apparently a number of things, but what it does best, I think, is data collection and coordination, and they do have a very ambitious basin development planning program, which is at the stage of basically collecting and modeling data at the moment, and they've made some significant progress with that, I think. Well, the Chinese are sharing information now, but obviously there is discrepancy. But there is no one else trying to do this with this amount of cooperation and data from the downstream. So I would say this is still the best stuff that's going on for that. The question of scale in comparing Chinese dams with downstream dams, yes, but scale works both ways. The Chinese dams, obviously, it's a cascade of 8. 2 are now completed, 3 are in process of construction. As you indicate, some of them, there are 2 very, very large dams in that cascade. On the other hand, China contributes only 16% of the flow of the Mekong mainstream. Well, yes, I know. Well, not all the dry. Yeah, a lot of the dry, but well, the figure actually is debated, 45% to 65%. So scale has to be balanced the other way as well. And Laos also has a very, very large dam, which is currently being built, the Nam Tuen 2, which most people probably would have heard of, which is being funded, which has been facilitated by the World Bank. So, and arguably something like the Nam Tuen 2, which is on a tributary, not on the mainstream, would actually have larger impacts on the totality of the Mekong system than some of the Chinese dams. So I think these things have to be sort of balanced out. And again, because there is no comparable, so the system of EIA or TIAs, it's hard to sort of make that comparison at this point. Where should this issue be addressed is a bit of a complicated. There's a bit of difficulty. It's unrealistic to expect a bank to do this. The Asian Development Bank is a lending institution. It is driven by very particular motives, which I think one has to be realistic about that. The Mekong River Commission obviously is limited by membership and by political clout. But it still is the only institution that has sustainable development as its apparent aim. I don't know what the prospects are of Chinese membership. It doesn't look likely for now. And I think Chinese intentional cooperation is very hard to gauge. My studies in China, my interviews in Beijing and in Kunming and other bits of Yunnan province don't lead me to particularly optimistic forecast for this. One thing to be said is that Chinese policymakers, scholars, others working on this issue are very much aware of the discourse outside of China on this issue. Very much aware of the legal frameworks, potential binds that would fall on them if they sign up to certain agreements. Lots of studies have been done on this in Chinese, and with that knowledge, I think the central and provincial authorities are extremely unwilling to get themselves into this position of being bound until they've completed the most urgent and important of these projects on the mainstream. So I don't think that in the short term, in the next 10 years or so, we are going to see much movement on this. Yeah.
Can I interject for you real quick before you make a comment, Carl? That you mentioned, because this was on my mind too, Beijing versus Yunnan. I mean, that sometimes you hear some things coming from Beijing. Beijing tends, pushing the EIA process, the public participation, and giving, sometimes allowing, the NGO movement in China against the dam specifically, in that region, mainly on the Nujiang, but that some people have speculated that it's often the Yunnan provincial government for their own local benefit. In your interviews, did you see kind of a divergence in was there a little bit more progressiveness in terms of making the dams more sustainable from Beijing than, not that people in Yunnan say, yes, we're going to destroy, but...
Yes, but I think the divide is probably smaller than some of the studies on the Nujiang suggest. Okay. But it could be because the Nujiang is just so much more controversial at the moment than the Lancang. And I think one wants to be careful when sort of saying that central authorities are sort of more open on this issue. I think, again, the same line, they're much more aware, much more informed, and much more... the imperative of seizing the diplomatic initiative is much stronger in Beijing. And that is translated in some of these issues to mean, let's call a regional meeting, let's offer to share information. But under no circumstances should we allow ourselves to be bound by any kind of agreement. We'll do this as our initiative. right? So I mean, there are very clear limits to some of this openness. And EIAs, yes, but as Carl has shown in his presentation, who does this is a bit of an issue. So, I mean, we really shouldn't want to be in a position where we have, Chinese authorities doing EIAs or any government authorities doing EIAs, preferably, I think, yeah.
Carl, did you have any comments on his queries?
The one thing that I would like to focus on is where should this be addressed or who should address it. I think Evelyn covered everything very well. I agree that the MRC is probably the most likely candidate, generally speaking. It has a lot of weaknesses, largely because the governments have not given it a mandate to do anything without their permission, and that there is not much of a desire to see the MRC do much without their permission. And I mention this because the Yalie Falls experience is a really good example where there were complaints by the communities. And the Cambodian government wasn't really pushing them for reasons I alluded to earlier. And so what can they do? And the MRC, I think, commissioned a study of the assessment of the Yalie Falls Dam that said that resulted in a finding that the initial TIA was flawed in a number of ways. But that was it. Repeated attempts to go back to the MRC did not lead to anything because it couldn't lead to anything. And I think it's important to consider some of the examples from elsewhere in terms of where you have a stronger ability to investigate claims as a means of peaceful dispute settlement and bringing issues to the fore. I think the ADB is an appropriate venue for ADB-funded projects. And the World Bank, through its inspection panel, has, I think, provided a model for how this can be done. But that is only for the projects that that particular bank funds. So ADB certainly has a role here, and it can play a model role, but it's not going to address all of the projects, especially when it comes to China, which has the flexibility to say, do we want to take money from a development bank, or do we want to do it on our own? And sometimes there have been examples where they've said, okay, we're just going to do it alone because we don't have to worry about these particular procedures.
Okay. Yes.
Malik, I just want to make an observation in relation to what Evelyn said. I think these multilateral banks do have a role. They come across as more neutral entities, honest brokers. And one example is that they did this Indus Basin Treaty between India and Pakistan, and there was a major conflict in the brewing, but they asked World Bank, and of course there was an independent expert, and he passed his judgment, and both India and Pakistan are claiming it as their victory. So this multilateral institutions can play a role. But coming to China, of course, if you are going to tell them don't build 3 gorges, they'll say, okay, we don't need your money. But if you want China to be involved as a responsible citizen, I think they are more eager to please. So, yes, do multilateral institutions have a role? Yes.
And you are from the World Bank, too.
Oh, no, well, not really. Thank you.
No, but that's why you understood, yeah. And next question. Can bop you over there. Thank you.
Claudia Ringler, IFPRI. I first have 2 observations on Carl's presentation. The navigation agreement, I think when they did the TIA, it was a foregone conclusion. It was already completely decided. And the soil erosion issue, they said there wouldn't be any soil erosion, I believe, because that was the biggest concern of Laos. They were very afraid of losing, of a change in their country boundary, because the river is their national boundary, and that's that could have been the only reason for them to go out of it. If, you know, one of the results is that actually, oh yeah, your country boundary will keep changing now, day by day, or, you know. So I think that was the reason why they said there is no soil erosion. They had to say that. Even so, they knew there would be. In terms of Yalie Falls, I think what's also interesting is I've worked in an institution in southern Vietnam that's responsible for looking at the long-term impacts of upstream development on the Mekong Delta. Even so, it's a Vietnamese organization. They were not given the data of the release data from Yalie Falls. Even so, it's a Vietnamese dam that has impacts on Vietnam downstream. So again, as you already stressed, the information issue is just crucial. It's really important. And it's not only information at the intergovernmental level, it's even information issues within the country. So in terms of the earlier question on models, I agree with what Evelyn said. The best model still is currently at MRC. They do not have a mandate to model China, of course, but they have to model the inflows into Laos, Thailand, etc., from China. And there is an agreement, and MRCS has put flow meters up in China. So that's kind of the agreement on data sharing. But basically, MRC pays, the governments pay for that, pay for the data to come down into MRCS. And obviously, as other observants have stated, there is no benefit from China at this point of joining or being more than an observer, apart from this responsible citizen. That's kind of the only driver or the only way to get them more involved. And people stated at the beginning when they did negotiate the new agreement, the negotiator went to China and asked them, is there any chance that you're interested in joining? And they basically said, okay, can we get the downstream countries to pay for increased tri-season flow from all the dams we plan to build? And basically the negotiator said, sorry, no, there's very unlikely that you will get them to pay. So they're like, okay, there's no reason for us to join. There's really no benefit from us, at least in the short term, as people have said. So that's it, just some observations.
Good comments. Some other comments or questions? Right here.
Listening to you talk about the lack of baseline data, I started to wonder if, this is an old issue even with EIAs here in the U.S., but it seems to me like a more constructive approach might be to, instead of impact assessment, to use those to gather the baseline data as a basis for future liability and to establish what the rights and some agreement up front about rights and responsibilities. Probably idealistic, but that, if you have any thoughts about that as a policy, I'd love to hear it.
In terms of encouraging governments to collect data, I think the last thing you want to talk about is liability. If you're talking about improved decision making, both on on the development of that dam, on the operation of it, and then more broadly in development within the basin, I think that's going to be a stronger argument in terms of actually collecting the data. I think the talk about the rights of communities or the liability for damage to communities, that's where life gets a little more entertaining.
I think the problem with sort of data is not, there's quite a great deal of hydrological data for the lower basin that goes back quite a long time. It's, we're looking at 100-year period and beyond. And it seems to me that the problem is not that, it's the other things. It's the social data, the soil data and so on and so forth. But in terms of hydrological, it's there.
Or the ecological.
Yeah, it's the other sort of
census of
fish and fauna, flora and fauna and so on. Yeah.
I was wondering, just to add on that, if maybe both of you do know that, I've gotten emails from a number of some downstream non-governmental organizations, and I'm very familiar with the Chinese groups that are doing work, and there's a lot of talk about more networking, and I think the challenge has always been trying to get the Chinese NGOs over because they're kind of worried about sensitivity. But can any of you make any comments about what you see, at least at the downstream, the NGO networking around the basin? Because those are people who are also gathering their own data, and I'm not as familiar. I know China and the power or lack thereof of the NGOs, and I was curious if you could make any comments on downstream, because those could be useful sources of info and checking.
The Thai NGOs are doing quite a great deal, and they've got themselves organized into networks, and A lot of the sort of social data and the sort of community data is being collected by them in association. You may have come across for the channel navigation issue as well.
And my impression is that most of the data still is anecdotal, which is a problem in terms of. I'm just saying this is the response when you talk about Yalie Falls, the impacts that this village was flooded. Well, show me proof. Show me the photographs. Show me where it was before and after. Quantify it in a way that you did not have to quantify things for the impact assessment. Similarly, because a lot of the people, a lot of the NGOs that are collecting the data are advocacy organizations, they are a priori distrusted because they have a perceived agenda. So and the Mekong River Commission isn't in a position to collect a lot of this data, to go out and do the field studies, and the governments aren't doing it. So there's somehow the data that is being collected is being dismissed, even if it's being shared. And there's no, I don't think that there's a really good repository for the information or for vetting it, let alone collecting it, so that governments are willing to consider it in a meaningful way. And I think some of that's the politics of not wanting to hear the answer.
Okay, we have a question in the back.
Risay Poch from Voice of America Cambodian Service. Question for both of you, Carl and Evelyn. You mentioned China has given a lot of aid, a lot of grants to Cambodia. Like $500 million is a lot of money. And how can Cambodia stand up to China and tell them that these negative impacts, socio-economic impact on Cambodia, what can Cambodia do? Thanks.
I think that might be your answer.
I think Cambodia has some scope. First of all, China is not by any means Cambodia's largest aid donor or investor. Cambodia's largest commercial and aid partner is still Japan. And the kind of money that is given is different. China has given some very sort of high-profile type money, as it has done all throughout the region. And Cambodia's strategy across the 1990s has been a little bit sort of difficult for domestic reasons. But if you look at the other countries in the Mekong, one of the sort of ways that they've thought to overcome the sort of power disparity problem is to take collective action in other kinds of regional organizations where they think they would have more voice, as it were. So working through ASEAN, for example, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has been something that Vietnam, for instance, has tried to do. Again, on Mekong issues, it's a little bit difficult because ASEAN doesn't particularly have a Mekong interest apart from the building of the rail connection from Kunming to Singapore. That's about the sum total of its interest. But China-Southeast Asia cooperation on the Mekong is gradually being written into a lot of these China-ASEAN agreements, expansion of cooperation, etc. So that's one way in which some of these things can be brought into that framework. Apart from that, I have to say that from my sort of interviews in Cambodia, it's been difficult. Of all the countries, it's quite marked that Cambodian authorities seem to be the ones who are most pessimistic about this. And I had a minister say to me, well, all we want at this point is for them to give us some information about what they're doing. We don't actually think we can influence anything. We just want to have the information so we can deal with some of the impacts that we might be able to try and predict from that information, and we're not even getting that. So it's quite a sort of minimal expectation at this point. So I'm afraid I don't think it's very optimistic. But the other problem is Cambodia has its own problems, right? It's very hard to say to the Chinese, your dams are causing us to lose fish, when you are overfishing the Tonle Sap as it is. Again, it's a case of data and where do you pinpoint causes. There are domestic causes of some of these negative impacts.
Okay, and right there, Ken, the gentleman there in the blue shirt. Thank you.
Hello, Michael Martin from Congressional Research Service.
if I may say, there seems to be almost a little deflection about one issue that's gone on in both presentations, either a concern because a, quote, lack of data, looking at sort of the one end, we don't have data, so therefore we're having problems, or going the other extreme, you know, it was a predetermined outcome, predetermined solution, the political environment, such and such. I'm curious about the middle ground, that is to say the quality of the methodology. Say, looking at the river flows, they said that there's going to be no change in velocity. Was it a poor modeling? Was the parametric equations wrong? Did, you know, in the technical aspect or in that middle ground in terms of the actual content of the EIA, could I have some comments on the quality of the work being done by the technicians? Are they being overly determined by political considerations? Is it a situation where they didn't understand the scope of the issues at hand? I'd be curious on that particular aspect.
Thank you.
A couple of little answers to that. One, there often is, they are told by the directors, the technical people who are doing the TIA. And in the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, they said, you know, there are these 50, 60 different types of impacts we're predicting. And they went through them just in the process. And the director said, kick these out, because these are transboundary. We don't want to look at transboundary impacts. Which is analogous to the situation with Yalie Falls, where they were saying, you know, the scope of the impacts you're going to assess is 8 kilometers downstream, 1 kilometer wide. So it's not that there is any sort of methodological problem with what the scope of what they're looking at. It's just that it's been politically predetermined. On the navigation channel, I think the point you made about the Laotian border and that Claudia Ringler made is...
Excuse me, that still gets back into a political boundary. What I'm saying is, take that 8 kilometer by 1 kilometer wide stretch. Were they accurate within that stretch? Or going back to the Laotian one, when they did the modeling, okay, they knew it was going to move back. You're saying they knew it was going to move back and forth. Were they correct in the sense that they were moving back and forth? I think there's a whole range in this middle that
they were not, my understanding is it was a political decision and they were not allowed to report anything that would not be approved higher up.
Okay, so you don't know the answer to that particular. But within
but
that
the general feeling of everyone working on it was clear.
I mean, I'm an economist, and to be honest, many times we think we know what we're talking about. We set up parametric equations for modeling our system, and then when the results come back and we do a sensitivity study, we're way off. We're really, you know, sometimes order of magnitude off. And that's what I'm trying to get into.
Can you grab the mic? Sorry.
Okay.
He's all done now. The people on the webcast are like,
no,
huh?
And that is really what we are trying to get at with our study. And what was interesting was that so many of the analyses were predetermined, or there's a heavy thumb on the scales from the political side. I would say that the Lake Victoria example is maybe a different experience in that the analysis, particularly after they went through the public participation process and did subsequent analyses on the specificity of the weevils, that the analysis was pretty much spot on, that the effects were as predicted. But that was in part, the only significant variance we found was that the water hyacinth came back sooner than expected. It was expected it would come back. It's hard to eradicate these things entirely. And what they had failed to do was to account for continuing releases of water hyacinth upstream from Rwanda. So, but you know, this in terms of the impacts, you know, this is a pretty good comparison between predicted and actual. Now, Apupa Dam hasn't been constructed yet. So it's hard to know what the actual impacts are. And in fact, there's a good chance that they will wind up going to the Baines Point site, which is an alternative site with fewer impacts. The Lesotho Highlands Water Project, unwillingness to, they basically assumed a lot of things socially, that it would just, there wouldn't be resistance, so the transaction costs are lower, and they assumed, you know, no corruption, and there was great corruption, which led to greater resistance. So I think that the modeling in the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, there you have to figure out how do we address corruption, and that may apply to other cases. The environmental impacts, though, it's hard to kind of compare the predicate with actual downstream, because they weren't allowed to do that. Within the bounds, within Lesotho, I think they were under-predicted, but not in order of magnitude, if you will.
Could I?
Yeah, sure.
I think you're asking a question which I agree with, and I think I have a straight answer to that. I was trained to do environmental impact assessments in hydrology. In my previous life, I was a geographer and geologist. And in some of these cases that Carl's very quickly presented, it's blatantly wrong. It's not possible that you would imagine channel modification taking away sort of rapids and shoals and other things, and there to be no impact on velocity even 1 kilometer downstream. Impossible. We have established sort of grids and models to do these kinds of modelings with, and that is just inconceivable. It doesn't make sense. And the idea that sort of one shoal system is not connected to the other is just absurd. So it's blatantly wrong.
Okay, there's a question there. We'll be real quick. So if we can be quick with our questions, I think there's a lot of burning issues here.
Okay. My question is actually going a little bit on a different sort of road. I'm Margie Huang from Windrock International. I was just curious to know, there was some mention about an increase in illegal trade in terms of timber, wildlife, and even drugs and all. And I just wonder if there's been any dialogue among the upstreams and downstream countries in terms of addressing this issue. It seems that there are certain issues in terms of, sort of the hydropower dams upstream, the countries upstream not wanting to negotiate with the downstream countries because they don't feel like they have anything to gain from it. But something in terms of like the illegal trade, I would think that if it affects them, that would be something that they would be concerned about and would want to discuss with the downstream countries.
Thank you.
Drugs is something they're very keen to talk about, and they talk about all the time in various fora, not just the Mekong specific ones, in the Southeast Asia China dialogues as well, and so on and so forth. That of course is a long-standing issue. It's been made worse by the ease of border crossings now with the bridges and etc. So that's talked about a lot. Timber trade, no, because the militaries of the various countries are heavily implicated in this. So no, that's not talked about. Human trafficking and other sorts of things are also talked about. And it's a tricky one. I mean, there are sort of, attempts to sort of coordinate on controlling the drugs issue and the human trafficking issue, but not really on anything else. And, yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, I meant to point to you earlier. Helen? Oh, you have to grab the mic for folks in webland.
I'm Helen Rafael, Resources for the Future. As a lawyer myself, I'm curious to know what was the precise, either actual or expected or hoped for contribution of the Environmental Law Institute. So far we seem to be talking about economics, sociology, technology, politics, and so forth. What did you hope to accomplish, if not liability, responsibility, from the law point of view?
This project fits into a broader collaboration between the University of Tokyo and ELI on public involvement in the management of international watercourses and the legal frameworks governing that. And we had done some research looking at legal mandates for transboundary impact assessment and including public participation in those assessments. That was more of a desk study. And what we found was that there were numerous provisions, numerous requirements for TIA, but there wasn't much standardized or detailed in how to do it. And so what we wanted to do was to say, okay, there have been requirements for more than a decade, in some cases almost 2 decades. What's happened? What have we learned from these experiences that might influence the further development of legal regimes, whether it's, I should say, legal or policies, so that it may be international agreements such as the Espoo Convention or the Environmental Protocol of the East African Community, or development bank policies and safeguards.
And Carl, could you mention that I know that there's a book that's coming out or something soon, and maybe a next step?
We have published a book on the broader aspects of public involvement in the management of international watercourses through UNU Press, 2005 publication. We are currently producing the 5 case studies that I discussed here, as well as synthesis for publication this year, 2007, in the International Journal of Water Resources Management.
Okay, good. Some other questions, comments? Raise your hands high so I can send Ken sprinting towards you. Yes, Wang Liang.
Wang Liang, George Washington University. My question is more to Evelyn Goh. I've read Chinese scholars writing about Chinese foreign policy, and they cite the Mekong River case as a positive change of Chinese foreign policy in terms of environment and other non-traditional issues have becoming more and more important in Chinese foreign policy, and as a responsible power for the China becomes more engaged in Southeast Asia and other neighboring countries who are in a weaker position vis-a-vis China. But from your presentation or interview, you mentioned that your impression of Chinese policymakers towards Mekong is kind of positive. But I was just thinking that if you make an argument that saying that if China becomes more positive in Mekong River cooperation, it will be a showcase of China's, let's say, peaceful development and China's image as a responsible power, considering China's leadership is very more concerned about China's international image right now compared to a few years ago. So from an interview, do you find any message from the top level which emphasize China's image, especially in Southeast Asia? As you point out, the impact of China's rise is very explicit, and it will be a really good example for China to gain, at least politically. Thank you.
I've read all the same things as you've read, and this is a very difficult one to put across, and let me try and do this again. Basically, I think that the Chinese have got it sussed, right? Their strategy works in Southeast Asia. Look, 负责任的大国 means what, right? It means you turn up at all the meetings. It means you talk to the MRC even though you're not a partner. It means you don't say, no, I don't want to be a member. It means you say, we'll see.
Just one quick point. I think many Southeast Asia scholars have argued to be a...
Can you talk in the mic?
Power.
Sorry.
Just one quick sentence. I've seen scholars from South Asia arguing that if China wants to be a responsible power, it has to be more than just a receiver, also to be a giver.
Southeast Asians, frankly, don't have a right to say that, simply because they follow none of these conventions. They follow none of these practices that they wish to see China practice. So the Chinese win on this one, right? There's no way that we can go to China and say, you are bigger. You need to be seen to be responsible. So you should do all these things, which are costly to you, and which would, in some ways, derail some very, very ambitious programs for national development. Right? The dams in Yunnan are not just dams in Yunnan. They're there as part of a big national energy strategy to transfer power from west to east. And frankly, the Southeast Asians are not making massive demands on China. They're not in a position to, and they know they can't. So in this sense, yes, the Chinese presentation is right. I mean, the Chinese engagement in the Mekong is a good example. It's not good enough, but no one is asking it to do more. So China wins. unfortunately. But do you see what I'm trying to say? I mean, I've tried to give you a flavor of the two sides of Mekong development. There's all this big, regionalism stuff going on. That's all the upsides. Right? Everyone thinks that's great, even though the benefits are not dispersed evenly, but everyone thinks that's great. And so when they say this is, the nice face of our regional engagement, that's what they mean. And then they mean the sort of 5 million a year they give to the Asian Development Bank for its environmental core program. That's what they mean. I don't know what that money goes towards. Not entirely sure what it means, but that money goes there. So they can say, we do this, and environment is important. And we're building biodiversity corridors, whatever that means, in the Greater Mekong subregion. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but the money is going there. And it's a line item, and we can tick that off and say we're doing that.
Is also what you're saying, because I've been reading some things, and actually one of your colleagues that did the Mekong report, Carl, was that he wrote a paper for me saying that that under the economic development, you mentioned the railroads and the roads, saying that pulling China into the economic development in the region, that will, just kind of says that will have benefits for protecting the Mekong. But I guess my question do you see that linkage at all? That China becoming more integrated into the economy through the roads, the railroads, the trade, could that possibly make them more inclined in the end to be a better, an honest to goodness on the ground partner in protecting the Mekong? Or is it, in some ways, it's kind of maybe two different energies, like you said, like there's the Go West campaign, the 200 plus dams in southwest China it's its own machine that I kind of feel that maybe is not linked at all to this kind of Mekong dialogue. Do I have that right? Or
no, I think you're right. I think we can trust the Chinese, and they've done this for the last 15 years in Southeast Asia. We can trust them to sound right. And then we want to be very careful about what we can expect in terms of what is in their national interest, which I don't think is an unfair thing to say. Everyone in this region operates on national interest. And the bottom line is that, well, perhaps Southeast Asia needs to put itself in a position where it's in a better position to ask that other players take on costly adjustments. Unfortunately, it isn't at this point in time.
Do you have another question or comment from out here? And right next to us, conveniently located next to the microphone.
Steve Randolph from the National Defense University. Just, again, kind of a comment. I've been doing a lot of research on the end phase of America's war in Vietnam, and it's interesting that as part of the peace settlement, we agreed to commit what the North Vietnamese consider to be reparations, we consider to be reconstruction in that region, to the tune of about $4 billion back when that was real money. And they tried to set up a Southeast Asia Development Initiative under American leadership, sending the money through kind of a cutout into that region. And I'm just struck at this road not traveled that existed here 35 years ago or so in terms of America assisting in this kind of infrastructure upgrade and actually playing the predominant role probably in that region from that point till this, instead of China now kind of scooping this into their economic sphere. It's also interesting to contemplate what form this development would have taken if it had begun at that point.
Can I be very naughty and say we're glad that didn't happen? Because there were plans for something like 13 dams on the mainstream on the Mekong based on the example of the Tennessee Valley Authority programs in the 50s. Yeah. 50s, yeah. But that would, I think, be sort of the path we would have gone down, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yes, Richard again.
Thank you again. Actually, we talk about China, we talk about the U.S. now, but no one's really talked anything about Japan, which is the main driver of hydropower in this lower Mekong region anyway. And that in the case of the greater Mekong subregion, in 1992 when it was started, you could think of it as a Japanese vector northward into remote, impoverished, but potentially large market Yunnan province in that part of China. And then came along already the bubble had burst in Japan, but hadn't been quite appreciated yet. By 1995 or mid-90s, China is coming on now as a major, rapidly growing economy. And so now we have, in effect, a Chinese vector southward financed largely by Japanese money, both in the ADB and in the from the Japan Special Fund and other bilateral assistance. Rather curious. Just one other thing. Nobody's addressed the cost issue, the economic issue.
Okay.
I mean, there are a lot of people in China, including in Guangdong province, who think this is crazy to be building all these dams in Yunnan and exporting all this power, that in fact the net effect, especially if you take into account the environmental, ecological damage, is they don't pay for themselves.
They have unique cost-benefit analyses,
Yeah,
I think, going on in China right now. I mean, we could spend, and in fact, I have had quite a few meetings here with some environmentalists from China talking about the dam issues in China. That the slippage between the cost-benefit analyses. I mean, I think that actually even the Nuzhang dams have changed their tune a bit. Initially, there was going to be something. It would be like the equivalent of they wanted to ship the energy to Guangdong, which would be like the Hoover Dam supply in Chicago. Which I'm no economist, but I don't think that's quite. But it's been changing in some ways, and the Yunnan provincial government, for better or worse, is now talking more in terms of poverty alleviation in the area, and there is a lot more light being shown on it, and the environmental activists in China, I think, it's been very admirable what they've done in terms of really trying to push the government to enforce their new laws on EIAs, but also was the catalyst for empowering SEPA for creating the public participation regulations on EIA, and there's been a lot of international involvement, ABA, et cetera. I have an ABA person in the room, want to acknowledge their work in helping the SEPA in actually, helping to do these regulations. So I think that, there are things going on in China on dams that could actually change the equation in time, maybe.
I think what would be really interesting to compare is the Chinese experience in Yunnan with the SEPA-led type of reform, if you like, and then the sort of grassroots, pushed sides of reform, and the Laos experience. Because in Laos, what's happening is all being pushed by World Bank and ADB type introduced regulations. So now what you have is really nice looking pseudo legislation, but no sort of layer below that for how to implement this. So you just go and look at it on paper, it looks fantastic, but I'm not entirely sure how this is going to happen. So it would be nice to compare the two to see how far we get.
Dissertation is out there for someone.
Well, we need a bit of time.
Yeah, we need time.
Yeah.
Many dissertations. Carl, do you have some comments? Nope. Any final comments or questions? I think we've...
See, I think even Chinese admit that they have got very good regulations coming out of Beijing, but they are not implemented when it comes to the county level or the state level, because people at the state level and county level have very different interests. There's another observation about this hyacinth business. I was in Rwanda and I was telling these people that, we are developing all this rice culture and we are applying all this fertilizer, and it's going to create problem in Lake Victoria, somewhere way downstream, and of course some of those nitrogen may be ending up in Nile and in Nile Delta. It's very interesting, we say things, but it is very hard to do it. Yesterday I was reading National Environmental Action Plan from India, made in 1993. So they said, we have a major problem of non-point pollution. Have they done anything about it? So it's nice to blame China that they are not implementing policies that they are making, but really it goes on and on and on. I think what we are doing is we are continuously trying to harp on this issue. Hopefully, in due course of time, countries will take greater responsibility in implementing their own rules, laws, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you. Do either of you have any some comments to make here to close us out?
I think that raises two very important issues. One is most of the discussions around dams relate to water quantity, the timing and amount. But I think that as we develop more in the Mekong Basin, water quality is going to become an increasing issue, and it may sneak up on us if we're not prepared for it. Secondly, the importance of implementation is paramount, that we've been trying to We've identified the problems in many cases. We've tried to develop solutions, but we haven't been able to implement a lot of the solutions. Sometimes it's national level issues, sometimes it's local, and it's a lot of the things around non-point source pollution are local, and that's where it gets all the more difficult. So I think you highlighted in your brief comment 2 very important issues that we need to keep track of as we go forward.
I think my presentation was a bit more focused on big picture issues, but I just want to sort of, launch off Carl's presentation and say I think the answers are in the process level issues. And EIAs, TIAs are especially one of them. And we haven't had time to talk about, who does EIAs and TIAs. And in his study is very much, state-led. And there's so much room there for, I don't know what one does, legislate for it or make it a rule if you give money or something, that, there must be some sort of third-party monitoring or actually doing of EIA and TIA processes. And this is one thing that just simply is appalling in the Mekong Basin at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, did you have a quick?
One EIA.
Okay.
I know an EIA which was done by a UN agency.
You won't say which one? Okay, that's good.
I won't say which one.
Here, wait for the mic so Webland can hear this. This sounds good. So start over real quick.
I know of an EIA which was done by a UN agency. Even an idiot would know they have skirted around issues. So sometime, yes, we try to be a little political in our most technical subject matters as well. They were trying to help someone for a certain reason, so they said, oh, all these things are not going to have any impact. If they can do it, one of the Chinese state commissions of environmental this and this, institute of this and this, doing this or that EIA, they can obviously do something like that.
There are private companies which do this and pseudo-advocacy groups which do this as well. It doesn't just fall in state and UN bodies.
Yeah, which also there's a lot of, actually International Flora and Fauna has been doing an assessment of EIAs and ecological impact assessments in Western China. So if you're interested in that, just you can contact me and I can hook you up with those folks. It's really interesting because they're looking at really on the ground level of it is sometimes an issue of just honest to goodness capacity, and it's not always politically driven, and so it's really interesting what they're finding. I want to thank both of our speakers. First, applause for them. And also all of you, I see a lot of hiking boots out there who slogged it in through the muck and the mire. And want to note that that next month I actually have one meeting that going. My first meeting. This is like this spring of first for me. I'm actually going to have a meeting on focused on China's XM Bank in Africa, focused on Sudan, looking at some of the dam building there. Ooh, touching on some interesting issues. And so that's on the 22nd. I had a typo in my email for those of you that get it. It's on the 22nd at 9 to 11. The 21st, I get to, every year we do a film for the DC Environmental Film Festival. And this year we're actually looking at an HIV/AIDS film. And I didn't stay up long enough for the Oscars. Did they? They won. Oh, good. I can say we are hosting an Oscar award-winning documentary called The Blood of Yingzhou District. It's